In this lecture, we'll talk about the Cold War, which was sort of a cultural background from 1945 to 1991. The causes of the Cold War are not completely understood at this point. That is to say, historians disagree. There are four major positions. There's what we call the balance of forces theory, in which historians who follow this theory have decided to look at the Cold War from the point of view of the threat from Russian hegemony over large parts of the world, and Western Europe then gravitated toward the United States. So this is a more geopolitical theory based on balance of military forces. There's also an ideological differences theory, which assumes that capitalism and communism were incompatible. The United States, of course, being the image of capitalism, and the Soviet Union being the image of communism. Another strain of historians assumes that the fault for the Cold War lies mostly with Joseph Stalin and his insistence that territory equals security, which led to the Soviet Union taking control either directly or indirectly of a large amount of Eurasia, and that set the United States and its allies against Stalin's aggression. And then finally we have the idea of mutually exclusive post-war plans. That is, the way that both of these cultures saw the world was just so different that they weren't able to find compatible ways of working through the post-war. And that is the theory that if I had to choose one, and actually all of them have good points and demerits, but if I had to choose one, I would probably be happiest about the mutually exclusive post-war plans theory, mostly because it's large enough that it fits not just politics or military, but cultural, political, military problems, industrial problems, environmental questions. All of those things can fit into this mutually exclusive post-war plans model. So let's take a look at what happened in the post-war period. The post-war United States was in many ways superior after 1945, not just to the Soviet Union, but to most parts of the world in terms of its economy. American technology and American military power were also sort of above and beyond everyone else, with the possible exception of the Soviet Union in the case of military power. The United States controlled fully 50% of the gross national product of the world, and it was at the time in 1945 the sole possessor of atomic weapons. So the United States sat at a sort of dominant position and had not been, with the exception of the attack on Pearl Harbor and Japanese conquest of a couple of small islands off the coast of Alaska, the United States had not really been directly involved in the fighting in World War II, except for soldiers in Europe and the Pacific. Nearly a third of all Russians, however, had no homes by the end of the war. Much of World War II in Europe had been fought on Russian soil. Much of Russia's industrial and transportation infrastructure was destroyed. Millions of its citizens had been killed in the war. Still, the USSR controlled huge territory, had tremendous resources, which gave it amazing potential, and had the direction of Joseph Stalin, who may not have been the most perfect leader in the world, but he was the only person who really mattered in the Soviet Union and could direct Russian resources in pretty much any direction he wanted to. If you're curious about whether or not this is actually communism, that's arguable, but probably not. Britain and France, on the other hand, no longer were able to stand on their own after World War II. Their economies were shattered, their militaries were not in good shape, their societies were in disarray, and their economic distribution systems of food and basic needs were also in terrible shape. So they did their best to convince the United States not to isolate itself again, but instead to participate in the peace of the world after World War II. And in 1946, Churchill, in a part of his campaign to do that, even though he was no longer prime minister, visited the Fulton, Missouri campus of the University of Missouri and gave a graduation speech, I believe it was, where he described the Soviet sphere of influence that was appearing in 1946 in Eastern Europe as an iron curtain. In 1947, the United States began its response by announcing the Marshall Plan of economic aid to Europe, and the United States also accepted the responsibility to support Greece against a communist insurgency because Great Britain could no longer afford to continue its support for that. In 1948, Czechoslovakia was brought forcibly into the Soviet Union, literally dragged in with the use of tanks and soldiers by the Soviet Union. And in 1943, the United States presided over the Bretton Woods Conference on International Finance and reworked the world financial order in a way that made it much more classically liberal and much more in line with American capitalist goals. After World War II, Western leaders perceived the Soviet Union as the center of a world revolutionary movement, and there's no great surprise in this, of course, while Soviet leaders felt themselves surrounded by the Western countries and their North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was founded in 1949. The United States provided a venue for the United Nations provided a venue for face-to-face debate between the two sides in the Cold War, but their worldviews were really at odds, and so these meetings really ended up often in debate or opposition. The United Nations was established in 1945, and with a General Assembly, a Security Council, a full-time bureaucracy headed by the Secretary General and various specialized agencies, and all of the signatories of the United Nations Charter renounced war and territorial conquest. In practice, of course, the United Nations was seldom able to forestall or quell international conflicts, though it certainly tried. The decolonization of Africa and Asia greatly swelled the size of the General Assembly as new nations were born and joined. So the United Nations became an arena for expressing opinions, and resolutions carried great weight in the early years of the United Nations. The influx of new members made the General Assembly more concerned with poverty, racial discrimination, and the struggle against imperialism than with the Cold War, and so the Western powers increasingly ignored the General Assembly. Between 1944 and 1946, the Western capitalist countries created a new international monetary system in which supply and demand determined prices, and that included a system of exchange rates, an international monetary fund, and a World Bank. The Soviet Union was suspicious of Western intentions, and so it established a closed monetary system in which the state allocated goods and set prices for itself and for the communist states of Eastern Europe. The United States economy recovered and prospered during and after World War II. The economy of Western Europe, though it was heavily damaged during World War II, also recovered in the post-war period with the help of the American Marshall Plan. Western European governments generally increased their role in economic management during this period. In 1948, Europeans launched a process of economic cooperation and integration with the creation of the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, which expanded its membership as it developed into the European Economic Community, or Common Market, in 1957, and then into the European Community in 1970. The Soviet Union and Eastern European states relied on the government to determine the production, distribution, and price of goods. In the communist states, the recovery from World War II was rapid at first, but in the long run, the Soviet and Eastern European economies were unable to match those of the West in production of consumer goods, housing, and food. The rapid establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe led the United States to perceive the Soviet Union as a worldwide enemy. American perceptions led to the Truman Doctrine in 1947 and to the establishment of NATO in 1949, to which the Soviet Union responded by organizing the Warsaw Pact in 1955. A third Great War did not break out in Europe, but the Soviet Union and the West did each test each other's resolve in incidents such as the Soviet blockade of West Berlin in 1948 and 49, the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, and the West's encouragement of the rift between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Soviet power was used to ensure the obedience of Eastern European nations such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia, even with tanks and troops at times. In Korea, Soviet and American occupation of zones north and south of the 38th parallel led to the establishment in 1948 of a communist North Korea and a non-communist South Korea. North Korea's invasion of South Korea in 1950 marked the beginning of the Korean War, in which the United States came to the aid of South Korea while China sent troops to assist the North. A truce in 1953 fixed the border again at the 38th parallel, but no peace treaty has ever been concluded. After winning independence from France, Communist North Vietnam supported a communist guerrilla movement, the Viet Cong, against the non-communist government of South Vietnam. John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, decided to send American military advisors to assist South Vietnam, and President Lyndon Johnson gained congressional support for unlimited expansion of U.S. military deployment. Unable to stop the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies, the United States ended its involvement in Vietnam in 1973, and Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops took over South Vietnam in 1975. The Vietnam War brought significant casualties to both sides and gave rise to serious economic problems and to an anti-war movement in the United States. Members of the American military and their civilian supporters argued that government restrictions on American military operations had deprived the Americans of their chance for victory. Such restrictions were designed to prevent China from entering the war and possibly starting a nuclear confrontation. The existence of weapons of mass destruction affected all aspects of the Cold War confrontation, causing paranoia in the United States and spreading fear of nuclear destruction throughout the world. Fear of nuclear war seemed about to be realized when the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba in response to American deployment of such missiles in Turkey. But Soviet Premier Khrushchev backed down and withdrew the missiles from Cuba. The number, means of delivery, and destructive force of nuclear weapons increased enormously. But at the same time, the Soviet Union, the United States, and other countries made some progress on arms limitations. After 1972, the superpowers began the slow, arduous process of negotiating weapons limits. Rather than attempting to keep up with the expensive Soviet-American arms race, the European nations sought to relax tensions between East and West through such organizations as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which led to the signing of the Helsinki Accords. Space exploration was another offshoot of the nuclear arms race, as the ability to launch satellites and to send manned rockets into space was understood to signify equivalent achievements in the military sphere. And then we'll move on to decolonization and nation building in a later presentation.